Hello and welcome back to the Earth Day special. Very excited to welcome to the show our next guest, someone who I've enjoyed talking with in the past, the Vice President for Data for Progress, Julian NoiseCat. Welcome back to the network. Glad to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you here. Obviously, rough circumstances around the country and around the world that we're talking. But it is Earth Day. And so before we, launch into other topics, I'm curious, sort of what you're thinking about on this day. It's an important anniversary. Are you thinking at all about how to stay climate conscious, during this quarantine? What's going on?
I'm thinking about the way that there's for decades been a movement led primarily by people of color called the environmental justice movement. And one of the central sort of tenets of this movement is that there is an interrelationship between economy, environment, and people. And one of the studies that came out in the last couple of weeks that has gotten some attention was a Harvard University study that basically showed that communities and people who have prolonged exposure to air pollution are the most vulnerable to the coronavirus. Those communities are also the most vulnerable to toxic pollution and climate change. So I think that it's, as we think about Earth Day amidst the pandemic, it's important to revisit some of these things that the environmental justice movement and communities of color have been talking about for decades, because they are determining real world life or death outcomes right now.
Definitely. And thankfully we've had a few of our elected representatives who have been talking about that link, about the disparate outcomes in terms of the coronavirus that's wreaking havoc, especially in certain groups. I know Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been talking about it quite frequently. And so I'm sort of hoping that this is one of the things like that people get coming out of this, that they get that during this pandemic, that some groups are suffering more. But even once we get past the pandemic, those sorts of inequities were obviously already there in terms of any number of different respiratory illnesses and things like that. And so I'm sort of hoping that that can be one of the silver linings, that people realize in this emergency some of the things that were already there. Do you think that there are any other silver linings that might come out of this, that perhaps, people having a little bit of time with slightly lower levels of pollution might start to get them to question whether we can move in that direction more permanently? What do you think about the future?
So at Data for Progress, we are able to field surveys about public opinion on more left-leaning policies. And one of the more encouraging things that has come out of the coronavirus pandemic is that across the board on quite progressive policies like, giving folks $2,000 a month, a moratorium on evictions and rent, forgiveness of debt amidst this pandemic, all of those things. We've seen a spike in support for a lot of those policies, which to me suggests that the sort of appetite for a more liberal government, a government that's more active in people's lives in terms of like providing a social safety net and providing support for those who are, locked out of the economy or who are out of a job, could grow. And one of my central views is that we need a more activist government. We need a more progressive government if we have any shot at decarbonizing our economy and adapting to a warming planet. So my hope is that in the sort of growing public support for more social democratic form of government, we might have the ingredients for a government that could really actually try to take on the climate crisis at scale as we try to rebuild.
Yeah, I share the same goal. I hope that we do move in that direction. Obviously, I've been very open that I had been hoping that coming out of this, Bernie Sanders would be the nominee because I trusted him, especially on climate. It's not looking like it's going to go in that direction. And I know that the Data for Progress Green New Deal scorecard for Biden was not, it was not very excited about what he's already proposed. And so about a week ago, I think a number of different environmental organizations came out with sort of some of what they want to see for them to be enthusiastic about Joe Biden when it comes to this area. And so you say we need a more activist form of government. I guess the onus to some extent is on us to try to push it in that direction. What are some of the things that you think that people can be doing between now and the election to maybe move Biden or some of the other elected representatives in the right direction in these areas?
That's a really great question. So firstly, I would say that based upon our research, climate change is a very favorable general election issue for Democrats. A couple weeks ago, we published a study that showed that 2016 Trump voters who are unsure of how they're going to vote in 2020 are uniquely persuadable on climate change above all other issues. So Democrats in November should really be leaning into climate change as a way to draw a very favorable distinction with a president who has characterized global warming as a quote unquote hoax invented by the Chinese. So I think that firstly, we need to believe not only that this is an issue of scientific and moral importance, it's also increasingly a winning political issue for Democrats. You know, I would agree that Biden was not, in our view, the best candidate on climate change, but he's also running a fairly policy agnostic campaign. You know, his pitch to the electorate is, I'm your security blanket after you jump off the Trump roller coaster. And on the one hand, that might not be the most, inspiring message for millennials and the future of the party. But on the other hand, it means that he is fairly agnostic when it comes to policies and issues. And I think that with the right sort of inside-outside strategy, we really could get Joe Biden to commit to prioritizing climate change and into leaning into something that looks quite like a Green New Deal in terms of its investments and scale of ambition in taking on climate and environmental injustice.
Yeah, I certainly do hope so. I think that's one of the most important issues that he needs to be moved on and hopefully can be moved on. The last question I have for you is, those who have wanted a strong response to the climate crisis for some time acknowledge that there are a lot of opportunities in that in terms of, new jobs, new industries, all of that. But it will, of course, require some significant changes to the way that we live as well. Do you think that the experience of these lockdowns, even if they only last a few months, or if potentially it might end up having to be much longer, do you think that might make people a little bit more willing to consider other sorts of life changes to safeguard their future? Or do you think that people might get burned out on having to sacrifice? Which way do you think that might swing in the future, at least in America?
Ooh, big question. I'll be honest that I don't have a sort of grand theory of how this is all going to work out. And, for me personally, I feel like the end of my young adulthood is going to be marked by the pandemic. So I don't even know where I'm going to be at the end of all this stuff. But, in terms of how people think about climate and the environment, I've been thinking a lot about two things. Firstly, what people think and consider is essential work. I think that right now we are dramatically realigning our relationship to the economy and the labor market. And I'm hopeful that we start to think of, care workers, folks in the healthcare industry, teachers, all of those types of jobs as essential workers and start thinking about how important those things are. I think often when we sort of think about the economy and work, we have this sort of image of like a blue collar, worker in the Midwest. And obviously those workers are essential too, but so are the folks who take care of the old, take care of the young, and teach our children. And the thing about all those jobs is that they're also low to zero carbon jobs. There's very, very little pollution associated with those industries. And as we, as the population ages, and as we sort of shift to a more green economy, there might be ways of thinking about work and what is actually a quote unquote green job that might look beyond just the folks who install solar panels and build transmission lines. So I'm hoping that happens, that we sort of re-emphasize the importance of care work in our economy. And then secondly, I'm hoping that we think a little bit harder about some of these technologies that actually might allow us to have a lower emissions economy. In particular, I think a lot of folks who are still working right now and have the privilege of having a job are using Zoom and working from home. That means that there's actually a lot less emissions happening from commutes. And there's also opportunities in the future to use the internet for like telehealth. So you could go, see your doctor without having to go into the office. And all of those things around the margins do have an impact on emissions, and I think are things that we might see more of in the future after this pandemic.
Those would certainly be some good silver linings, and so I think we'll probably end on that bit of hope. Julian, as always, thank you so much for joining us, especially on Earth Day. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.